Frank, I want to thank you for taking this time, especially so early in the morning. I won't tell everybody what time it is, 3 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, Frank, thank you for coming in and being on the podcast. I've known you for many years. I taught I taught your daughter.
My daughter, yes.
I taught your daughter. I met your father.
Yes.
I met your father. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But before we talk about anything outside of you, let's talk about you. Okay, tell me where you were born.
Sure. I was born in Japan. I was born in Tokyo, and my father had grown up on a farm in Pennsylvania, in Valley Forge, and he had not really had much exposure to Asia. But he graduated from Princeton in the 1950s, and he was recruited by a certain agency on the south side of the Potomac River, and came here. And he was, that's why I was born here, was because my father was in the CIA.
Okay.
And he fell in love with Japan.
What was his job in the CIA? Do you know?
I do. He doesn't really talk about it much, but he had a facility with languages, and they stuffed him full of Japanese language and Chinese language, and he followed people that were speaking Chinese and were up to no good in Japan in the 1950s. I used to make a joke because parts of this are true. It's reported that the CIA paid a $5 million contribution to the Liberal Party and Democratic Party so that they would merge. And I described my father's job as after-sales support.
Okay.
To make sure that the LDP state merged.
Right.
When people in neighboring countries may have been seeking for instability.
And that was a time when they had a lot of agents in Japan. It seemed like everybody.
Well, I was only one,
China.
so
I just know the history.
Yeah. So there were a lot of people. It was a fertile environment.
It was.
But he loved it, and he supposedly left the agency and went and got a PhD. And one of the professors he knew became an ambassador under Kennedy. So he came back and was a bag carrier for Mr. Reischauer in the Reischauer embassy in the 1960s. And you might know a fellow in Tokyo called Joe Schmelzeis, who was an assistant to Ambassador Haggerty. Anyways, my father was one of the first assistants who was an American who reported only to the ambassador. And so he worked with Reischauer. So
what year was this, 1950?
So I was born in 57,
okay.
And then we were back in the U.S. for part of his PhD and back here. So back and forth a whole bunch of times, so 0 to 7.
0 to 7. Are you the only child?
No, I'm the oldest of 6.
Oldest of 6. You're the first child.
I'm the first child. As my brothers say, I'm the beta version.
There you go.
Yeah, my father worked out his aggression.
So how old is your father now?
He's 89.
89, doing well.
He's doing very well. He is living in Georgetown. He's had a career as, after he left the embassy, he was a journalist for a while, and then he was an academic for a while, and then he ran the U.S.-Japan Foundation.
Okay, were you close with your father?
We both are specialized in Japan. I wouldn't say that we're particularly close, but I see a lot of him. I think he's been more involved in academic and government stuff. I've been more involved in business stuff, so we haven't overlapped that much.
Right, right. But I mean, so growing up, I mean, was he present in your life a lot, or was he busy?
He was present for a while, and then he was less present. My parents divorced when I was a teenager, and then he wasn't very much around.
I know how's your mother doing?
She's doing very well, thanks. They both remarried, and they both have had successful after marriages, so to speak. Okay. And so they are both interested in Japanese and come to Japan a lot. Yeah.
Right. So between your mother and your father, they just had you, or did you have?
They had 6 children together.
Your mother and father did?
Yeah.
Wow. And you're the oldest of 6. Okay. 7 kids. So your mother, what did she do? Was she? She
was primarily a homemaker. You know, she's one of these characters that you only meet from the 1950s. She got married when she was 19. I was born when she was 22, and she doesn't have a college education, but she speaks fluent Japanese. But she's the homemaker.
Gotcha.
And she comes back, and she gets very interested because she's got lots of people to put through school. So she runs for the local school board. So she's a successful politician. She's the only successful politician who's run several times. She's been the trustee of several private schools. She has been running a real estate business, renting out a property. And so it's one of those things where people just say, oh, she's a 1950s homemaker, but when you dig underneath the surface,
you find all the stuff she's really done.
Yeah.
She's like, what I like to say, similar to being like a swan on water.
Yeah.
On the top, it looks like they're barely moving, but underneath, those little feet are just really pedaling.
That's a good image, yeah.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Let me ask, so what was your childhood growing up? How long did you live in Japan?
From the age of 0 to 7.
To 7. So did you go to Japanese school, or did you go
I went to the Happy Hill Yochien. And I don't remember much about Happy Hill, the famous Japanese expression, the Happy Hill, and I don't know where that was. I went to the old St. Mary's School on Daiichi Keihin.
Daiichi Keihin, wow.
And it's now an NTT data center.
Okay.
And it's right near Takanawa Gateway Station. And one of the joys of my life was I'd been hearing, coming back as an adult, about the power of the St. Mary's Mafia and the St. Mary's alumni group. It's very powerful.
That's right.
And my wife has I consider it humorous. She likes to say that if a husband and wife stand together at a cocktail reception, it's clear that they are both social failures because they don't have anyone else to talk to. So if I go to a reception, she immediately goes away from me. And
just to make sure. But your wife's Japanese.
Yes. Okay. And so you can imagine my astonishment at an embassy reception when she comes up right next to me and wants to talk to me and says she wants to introduce me to Paul. Paul, I have no, Paul who? And what's going on? Because you never talk to me in an embassy reception. This is like, we're going downhill socially. Right. So I meet this tall, handsome, athletic Asian American, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and we're kind of wondering why we're being introduced. He thinks he's God, and I think I'm God. There's only room for one God, and so, it's two American males.
Right.
And he looks at my card and he says, Packard. I used to know a Packard. He had white blonde hair, which I did have. I was completely blonde haired it was Paul Yonamine, the president of IBM, who was my classmate at St. Mary's. And he said, oh, once a St. Mary's man, you're always a St. Mary's man. And so Paul got me back in. I've now discovered that my classmate is Tony Calla, the manager of this club.
Whom I hired.
And Paul got me involved, and I now have 150 friends, which I didn't know I had, brothers that I didn't know I had. And we had, thanks to Paul, I had a wonderful 60th Conrecce party. I went to St. Mary's for 1st and 2nd grade.
And that's all it takes.
That's more about Paul Yonamine than me, and Tony. And they're really lovely people. So St. Mary's, I didn't know that it would be a gift that kept giving, but that was part of my childhood.
Wow, so after that, where'd you go?
And then we went to back to America. I lived in McLean, Virginia, which is near Washington, D.C. And then we moved to Philadelphia, kind of where my parents are from. My father's from Valley Forge, a farm, an agricultural area outside of Philadelphia. And my mother's from a college-y area. There's a Villanova College, Villanova University, Bryn Mawr, Haverford, that area. So that's where we grew up outside of. And then that's where I lived until I went to college.
Right, and then you were telling me, because of what I told you I did last night with my family, we held hands for the first time at a dinner. And I told you how I went about speaking. Tell me.
So Pennsylvania is one of the original colonies, and it was founded by Mr. Penn. And Sylvan, or Sylvania, means woods. So it's Penn's woods. He got us. If you look at Pennsylvania, it's a square box. They just drew it on a map. You get this box, Mr. Penn. And he was a religious refugee from England. So he comes in the 1600s and has a Quaker colony. So I have Quaker ancestors from Pennsylvania. And Quaker is an old religion, but it's also, I think, a very modern religion suitable for those of us who have faith, but we don't really like the church leaders. Right. And we don't like the sort of the dogma, the way a lot of Christians act today. And so I love some of the aspects of it called the Quaker Friends. So they don't have a church, they have a Friends meeting. So instead of having a Quaker religious school, they'll have it the Quaker Friends School, or Germantown Friends, or Roppongi Friends. And so one of the wonderful things I love is the way that they pray together, which is that they take hands around the table, and everyone holds hands, and we say, well, 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 here we are together. And it's a Quaker grace that I grew up with.
So you used to do that? Well, your parents weren't Quakers, were they?
My cousins or people in my life.
So you go. So sometimes you go there, and when you went to visit, then you'd end up being a part of that. Yeah.
So fast forward, my father is in the 1980s. He's the dean of a graduate school at Johns Hopkins called SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies. And international studies meant looking at Europe, looking at Atlantic. And he wanted to say, well, we ought to look at Asia. In the 1980s, that was considered radical, to look at Japan and China. So he wanted to establish connections here. And one connection is the International University Kokusai Daigaku in Niigata. But he wants to establish something in the old southern capital of Nanjing. And Nan is south in Chinese, and Jing is Kyo. So it's like Tokyo is eastern capital, Nanjing is southern capital. And he's going around and around with the Chinese authorities about establishing a relationship, and it's very, very communist. And they said, does your family have any sort of relations with China? And the early American relations were through missionaries. And it turns out that he said, well, I did have a relative, but we don't really know what happened to him. He was sort of considered the black sheep in the family because he was here in the 1930s, and apparently he chose the wrong side. The American version of the wrong side are the communists. You might remember the communists are in power. And it turns out that this distant relative, this Quaker missionary, had seen the Nanjing massacre going on and hidden somebody in his garden, who became Zhou Enlai, the foreign minister with Mao Zedong. And so he had saved a famous communist leader by just doing the right thing as a Quaker. Suddenly all the school was approved, and Johns Hopkins has a sister university relationship with Nanjing because of this because of this Quaker relative that did something. So that was interesting. My father doesn't really emphasize in the 1970s and 80s, it wasn't really popular to emphasize that he spoke Chinese. I've seen him speak Chinese. I've seen him speak Chinese to people, but he didn't want to really emphasize that aspect of his life. And I think that for a long time, the family downplayed what he actually did and why I was born here. I used to just say he was in the army. In fact,
is that something he would tell you to say?
That was what we said.
Okay.
In fact, when I met you, 15 years ago, I was still telling people in the military. And you said, well, I was in the military too.
That's right,
And I just sort of, and then I shuffled off and admired your basketball skills or admired your sons. And
gymnastics. I don't know how to play basketball.
Flying through the air.
But tell me this. So I remember I was sitting down with your father, and we had a very long conversation. And then we started talking about Mrs. Matsukata.
Because he was very overconfident, because he knew her sister, who was Mrs. Reischauer. So my father, Tane Matsukata's
she was
sister,
married to Reischauer,
yeah. So my father mistakenly thought he knew everything about the Matsukata family. Right. And you were gently telling him he didn't.
Okay, and I didn't realize that because I was very close with Matsukata-san. And we would talk all the time by her fireplace. And she told me things about her epilepsy. Because I asked her why, I'm very probing sometimes. So I was asking her why she never married. And she told me because she has epilepsy. And I said, so why? She said she thought it would be too much of a burden on her husband, and if they had kids, she was worried that if something happened. So she has thousands of kids as a result of that. But that was her biggest concern.
And so my father, Hana's grandfather, comes to see the gymnastics class with famous Professor Lee. And you come over and you're very people-oriented, and you realize that he's kind of old to be a dad, and you just pick up that he's a granddad. Right. And my father was a trustee of Nishimachi a while ago. He's very close to Rick Dyke. Okay. And Rick actually met my father in the 60s. Rick has known my father for 50 years. Rick was a Harvard student, and Reischauer used to be a Harvard professor. They met when my father was working for Reischauer. Right. So my father thought that he knew everything about the Matsukatas. And you were gently able to add to his information because he had no idea about. But what an interesting family. Haru Matsukata Reischauer was a journalist. And she also thought she would never get married. And there were these bright women. Mr. Reischauer had a wife who died of cancer and 3 young children. And he wanted a mother for them. And he wanted someone that he could talk to. And she was very intellectual and very like Tane. These wonderful Matsukata ladies.
That's right. Yeah. That's why this is a wonderful history. So when you told me that, I was really surprised. And especially the fact that you told me it was CIA. So that really shocked me. My goodness. So tell me, so what have you done in Japan? What are you doing in Japan? Well, I know a little bit of it.
So I came in the 1980s. I was working on Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
My father had done academics and government and policy, and I was more on the business side. And in the 1980s, Japan was booming and was beginning to boom. And unbelievably, the investment bank I worked for, it doesn't exist anymore, it's called what's called Payne Weber, could not find anybody to go to Tokyo in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was promoted well above my peers just to give me a nice title, and I suddenly showed up completely underqualified in Tokyo and was part of the financial services here. I thought I'd be here for 3 months or 6 months, but as you and I are both examples, once you're here, we're still here. Met wonderful Keiko, who I'm still married to 32 years later. And that turned into a career in finance, which was 6 years in Tokyo and then 12 years in Hong Kong. So 5 years of British Hong Kong and 7 years of Chinese Hong Kong. And then back here 18 years ago. So I've been involved in alternative investments. So these are things that are not stocks and bonds.
Mm-hmm.
So they're private equity or venture capital or real estate. They might be considered too risky for average people to invest in. Average people are just supposed to buy stocks and bonds. And it has been a fascinating time in Japan because they want higher returns and they have low interest rates here.
Mm-hmm.
So I help Japanese institutions, not individuals. I'm not dealing with general investors, but banks or insurance companies or trust banks to invest overseas.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm involved in finance, and that involves securities brokerage and investment advisory.
Right.
And of course, the pandemic has changed lots of business models.
I can imagine, yes.
So we've closed one business, and we're reorganizing, and my colleagues and I are excited about what the future has.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But you've always been a very positive person. I've always known you to be that way, no matter how bad it was, because you've come to me for a couple of times,
Yeah.
and we've always talked and always worked it out, and I've always admired you for that.
Well, I've always admired you as a person. I remember you thinking that you had some fantastic business. I believe it was renovating or moving out modern hospital equipment.
CT scanners.
CT scanners.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 1989 war came, and you were exposed in a certain way.
You remember that story? That was.
You have to be careful. I'm a fly trap. I do remember your stories, and because they inspire me, and because they inspire me about resilience. People, it's very trendy words that I don't even know what they mean anymore. Resilience or agile or this.
Right.
There's my friend. We got blown out of an apartment on the 12th floor, and my friend Lansley, he landed and went, darn, picked himself up and dusted himself off. I want to be that guy. So you're a little bit ahead of me in years, and someone that I look up to and say, well, if he can dust himself off, when we have a hard landing, just get up and do it again.
Yeah, I want people to know the kind of person you are. And your father, I never knew how rich his history was, and is, obviously. And your wife now, does your wife work?
She's very much involved with education, and I would describe her as an education consultant. Like, if you really are honest about people, everyone's an individual. It's hard to say you're an entrepreneur. Well, you're more than that. Or you're an athletics teacher. Mm-hmm. In her case, she had a series of activities in Hong Kong which really distressed her and propelled her into her current career, is that she would meet Japanese people in Hong Kong who would say, I'm Japanese, I don't need to mix with the local people. And there's this very strong 20, 30,000 Japanese community in Happy Valley living very, very Japanese lives. Mm-hmm. Japanese food, Japanese shops, Japanese schools. And then she would meet other people that would say, I don't know anything about the harvest. I don't know anything about Osechi Ryori. I can't. So she would meet these two kinds of Japanese, one that would be very uninternational and one that would be, I don't even know my own country. Right. And so she started getting into teaching cultural lessons. She went and got a master's degree at Hong Kong University in Asian art. And she started to notice something. It's interesting. You speak very good Japanese. You know the word for play is asobi.
Asobi, right.
And they actually have a word very similar. It's a slang word in both countries, and it means the same thing. When the steering wheel is not tight on the old cars, we would say it had play in the wheel. Mm-hmm. They have also asobi in the wheel. And the Japanese culture and Chinese culture is very ordered and rectilinear. Mm-hmm. The only town in all of Japan with right-angle streets is Kyoto. It's very Chinese. It's imitating Xi'an. But the Japanese like a little bit of off. So, you know, the circle, which is cut off,
That's
or
right.
the square with the corner cut off.
Right.
And so it's asobi. It's just, and it's a little bit off. And it's a very different thing. So the Japanese love cherry blossoms because they're so light and they're only there for the moment.
That's right.
Chinese love plum, which is very strong, and the blossoms don't blow off, and it weathers the storm. Both are important. Don't have attachment, and don't have and don't give up easily.
Right.
And so she came back and she started this theory. You can be Japanese and you can be international. So she has this group. Her maiden name was Imai. And both the Packards, she and I, suffer a bad sense of humor. So you would put her initials together, she would be KIP, Keiko Imai Packard. And so she wanted to be the ticket for internationalization. So remember the old green subway tickets we used to have with the corner turned off?
Yes.
She thought that the corner ripped off was very Japanese. It's sort of like an asobi. And so that's the logo, it's the subway ticket. She's the ticket to internationalization. And so they have KIP Kids, KIP, and she has both a foundation and an Ippan Shadan Hojin, and it is for Kanto area universities. And they do a cycle where in April, at the beginning of the school year, these university kids who are from all different universities, they don't want to have the Mombu Gakusho retiree who's doing the English club at Todai. They want to talk about real issues. And so they come up with a project, they research it, and then they make a report in March. So she's been doing this for 12 years. They discovered, and they choose really interesting topics. Did you know that internationalization in Japan, it's such a big thing. They want to have international education. And the Mombu Gakusho says, we want 300,000 Japanese studying overseas and 300,000 foreigners here. But they only pay for the foreigners coming in.
Right.
Did you know that Keio University students can study at Harvard, but they don't get credit? Harvard students can study at Keio, but they do get credit.
I didn't know that.
And so they have this asymmetry. They want internationalization, but they don't want to give up their Japaneseness. Another project that they did was after Fukushima, which was in March. They started their cycle in April. They discovered that there's no FEMA here. There's no Federal Emergency Management Association. And you can see it with the pandemic. There's no FEMA. There's no emergency management. It's just give it to the military. That's their they have floods, they have landslides,
they have earthquakes.
You might think that they would have an emergency. She produces a book in English and Japanese every May, and some of it's gone to the Kante, some of it's gone these reports, and there have been people from Boeidai, from the Defense Ministry, and now that she's done it for 12 years, people are in senior positions in Goldman Sachs, NHK Television, McKinsey, because they speak English and they're really caring about the world. And so
What you said people are in those organizations that came from her organization.
Yeah, so she's kind of like an after-school group for you kids who are in university.
Okay.
And so I think she's involved in education. She says she's involved in social problems. I said, you're involved in social solutions, not the problems. And so that's
beautiful.
And I think that Japanese don't ask a lot of young people, so these kids get responsibility. Think about your project. They get to interview ambassadors, business leaders. And it's resonated with people, very strong diplomats. A number of our friends, Mr. Takashima, Mr. Numata, a number of your and my mutual friends, retired diplomats, have been very engaged with her. And they've engaged with university students around the world. She was quite a friend of Mr. and Mrs. Roos. And my wife has a distinctive personality, as all women do. And her first meeting with Susie Roos, she got into an argument with her. And they're meeting at a tea, and Mrs. Roos is going around shaking hands with the ladies, and says to Keiko, "What do you do?" And she says, "I'm involved with education." And Mrs. Roos said, "My husband would be interested in meeting you." And Keiko said, "No, he wouldn't." And they got into an argument about whether Ambassador Roos would be interested in meeting Keiko. And Mrs. Roos said, "I like you," and dragged her. I met John Roos about 25 times. He's a lovely man, but he never bothered to learn my name. My name, he would greet me and say, "We've met before." My British friends would ask me, "So what did you study in college?" And I would say American history. And they say, "Of course, because it's so short compared to British history." But Americans are very ahistorical, and what you've just described, and this is all going out, definitely, is the short-mindedness. Most
Isn't
Americans think that history began with me, when
That's
I became
right.
president,
That's
when I
right.
became.
Isn't that something?
And it's interesting because there are some, I'm very aware, having lived for most of my life in Japanese culture and Chinese culture, how young American culture is.
Mm-hmm. It becomes really evident when you're outside of your country. And I think when you get outside the forest, you can finally see the trees.
And this is definitely Mr. Definitely
Yes.
out. But I find that Americans are obsessed with people in their 20s. Second wives, breast jobs, getting in Lycra, all this stuff. Americans want to be 22 again, 25. I was a jerk when I was 25.
So was I.
Yeah, and so I'm hopefully a little bit wiser. But to get old is to be admired in Japan. To get old is to be discarded in America.
Isn't it something?
And I don't think it's an accident that you and I, who have options, choose to spend our silver years in Japan.
Right.
Because it's a good thing to be a silver person in Japan.
Don't you think so?
And less in America.
That's right.
You can try this. Go to a company and say, where's the senior person? It's not the branch manager, it's the oldest person. Senior has a special thing, and you and I are seniors.
Right.
But I'm sad, but I'm not surprised that your story.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can go back on live.
Yeah. That's interesting. That is so interesting. So what do you see for yourself in the future? I know you're very positive and you have nothing but blue skies ahead.
I see Japan as being a surprising winner in terms of the environment stakes. There's going to be a lot of, I think, military adventurism around water and rivers. Things like the Mekong River, which ends up in Vietnam, flows through 9 countries, and the water comes out of the Tibetan Plateau, which is owned by China.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's going to be a lot of fighting over water.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as we've seen this year, Japan has no shortage of rain and water.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. I think Japan is blessed with all sorts of incredible natural resources in terms of wind,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of solar, in terms of geothermal. So I think in terms of those kind of industries, I think that Japan has really prioritized certain industries which people forget that America even made televisions or made cars
Mm-hmm.
or did things, and they've said that those are strategic. So you see Toyota's not called, the name of the company is Toyota Motors, but they emphasize mobility and not motors.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that Japan, it's trendy to dismiss Japan as it has been.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, for example, in my area, finance, now the Tokyo Stock Exchange has 14 applications for companies that might have chosen Hong Kong or New York. But compared to the turmoil, so these Chinese companies are being kicked off the New York Stock Exchange, and these they're looking at Japan as, wow, they've got rule of law, they've got lots of savings, they really want to do the right thing, they've improved corporate governance. Our mutual friend Nick Bennis and some other
Mm-hmm.
people have been very involved in that. And so I think Japan's going to be a surprising winner
Mm-hmm.
in the stakes. It's fascinating. After a bumpy few years with the former president of the United States, both countries have changed leaders. And Mr. Suga's administration and Mr. Biden's administration both have green platforms,
Mm-hmm.
net zero carbon. And I think Japan has a partner in America, and of course I'm biased. It's what our family does. Get
Mhm.
Japan and America together.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's going to be a great place here.
Mm-hmm.
I worry about some reactions in Japan that think that foreigners bring COVID, bring problems and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think Japan is not perfect, and there's a place for people like you and me who love both countries,
Mhm.
are married into both countries,
Mm-hmm.
to play a role. So I see it'll be a great place to grow old together with you.
Wow. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Frank. I couldn't think of anyone better to have on than you. And I hope it's not the last time.
It won't be.
Good,
No.
good. I want to thank all of you for watching this podcast. Remember, it's all on loan. Keep reaching for the stars. And you're too blessed to be stressed.